The year 1989 marked the beginning of a remarkable two-decade stretch of global history that was characterized by the hegemony of the United States. This hegemony encompassed all dimensions of power: military, political, economic, and ideological. This dominance led to the rapid spread of democratic ideas throughout many parts of the world. In the second phase of what Samuel Huntington labeled the third wave of democratization. The kind of hegemony enjoyed by the U.S. in this period was unusual in human history and began to unravel during the early 2000s. There are two events in particular marking this turnaround: the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the 2008 financial crisis. Both of these developments reflected American hubris and overconfidence in its own model and produced catastrophic consequences that we are still experiencing today. There is a rebalancing of global power after 2008. Europe had been a sometime partner of the U.S. in promoting democracy through its eastern half, but began to realize that its interests did not always align with those of Washington at the time of the Iraq War. This period also saw the rise of Russia and China as alternative poles to both the U.S. and Europe, and growing divisions within the United States over its own role internationally. Global democracy, according to Freedom House, has seen annual declines over the past 17 years, or roughly since 2008, capped off by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the rise of populism in the United States itself that has scrambled the country's politics. It's impossible to predict what the next 20 years will look like with respect to global democracy, since there are major uncertainties surrounding each of the driving variables. The struggle between authoritarianism and democracy centers today around Russia and China on the one hand, and the United States and Europe on the other. Russia's future and the future of Europe will depend in large measure on the military outcome of the current war in Ukraine. If Ukraine is able to expel Russian forces from at least its southern parts, it may be able to achieve a significant respite and national survival. If Russia holds on and grinds away at Ukrainian power, on the other hand, its decision to invade might yet be vindicated. China, for its part, faces major choices as well, in particular whether it will seek to retake Taiwan by force. If the latter happens quickly and successfully, it will become fully dominant in Asia and will be able to project its power and its authoritarian model around much of the world. China, however, faces big internal problems. It is likely past its peak in terms of its growth model, and that is in serious jeopardy today. Its local governments are bankrupt, its entrepreneurial private sector under strict state control. Many of its Belt and Road projects are themselves insolvent, and thus China's ability to garner influence around the world is turned out to be self-limiting. And finally, the United States has not rid itself of the disease of populism. As many as a third of American voters have bought into the idea that the country is fundamentally corrupt and needs radical change. And they've in effect switched sides in the global struggle between democracy and autocracy. The country could turn to further radicalization and violence. On the other hand, such voters are a clear minority in the population and will have trouble winning future elections. So we could see a clear repudiation of this brand of populist nationalism in the 2024 presidential election. The ideological preferences that dominate a particular period of history depend, for better or worse, on the perceived success of different political models more than on those models' intrinsic merits. How future historians will characterize the coming decades will thus depend in large measure on the relative perceived success of these big power blocks. This is something we simply cannot foretell at the present moment, given the deep uncertainties involving all of them. Quite apart from geopolitics, there are socioeconomic factors that will shape societies, and therefore the political orders they create. The post-1989 world emerged in the midst of a huge transition from an industrial era to an information economy. The coming period will be dominated by new technologies like artificial intelligence and new sources of energy as the world moves away from fossil fuels. It's important to remember that there are potential upsides to these changes. While artificial intelligence may destroy jobs and livelihoods, it is just as likely to increase opportunities for people with lower levels of acquired skill and education. Something similar happened with the advent of the information age, which allowed hundreds of millions of women to move into workplaces around the world. The transition away from fossil fuels could also be democratizing, given their clear historical link to unaccountable authoritarian governments. What will the world look like when Russia, Saudi Arabia, and other oil producers see their chief source of income slashed? I want to conclude by pointing back to my 1989 article and 1992 book, The End of History. There have been endless misinterpretations of this phrase that were originally articulated by Hegel and Marx. The issue, of course, was not history in the conventional sense, but the question of what kind of society lay at the end of the modernization process. The Marxists, for many years, believed that the end of history would be a communist utopia, and I simply argued that that outcome wasn't likely. If there was a final outcome, it was much more likely to be liberal democracy linked to a market economy. After all of the democratic backsliding and reversals of the past 2 decades, I still believe that some version of this hypothesis is true. I don't believe that either Russia or China, or Iran or Venezuela for that matter, offer superior forms of political order that will ultimately displace liberal democracy. The latter has enduring strengths, but these will play out only if people fight for free societies. There is no automatic mechanism that propels history forward apart from the agency that individuals exercise in choosing their form of government. Thank you very much for listening.